Nahash, Steelshod, Adversaries, and Castlings. The Battlefield. Tabjonson has reached Alexander. The two stare each other down. On Alexander's flanks, he has Leon, Gerald, Levin, and Luke, who seems to have arrived from the western side of the battlefield. Behind him, but close by, Oliver, Yoren, Varley, and Michelle watch for an opportunity to support him. Tabjonson's support is less personal, a cluster of some of his better Svardic warriors and Bersarks. Most of his best champions have already fallen, withdrawn, or are indisposed elsewhere. But Abello Sakapus sits astride a horse behind him, and Hrafn the Sage stands to his left, clad in frost-iron plate, carrying a maul that looks like little more than an enormous block of carved stone lashed to a tree branch. Tabjonson utters a command in Svardic to his men, tells them to fall back. They are not to interfere with this fight with the Steelshod commander. The men look at Alexander's allies, who are not falling back. Tabjonson growls a word, and they withdraw. Hrafn remains, says something in Svardic. He speaks with a deep, even voice, not emotionless like Tabjonson, but simply calm. Tabjonson nods, and Hrafn remains in his position. Tabjonson looks back to Alexander. There is a moment of stillness before the inevitable clash. "Ragnar," Alexander says, drawing out the moment. "That name," Tabjonson replies quietly. "Where did you learn that name?" "From Hakon and Olaf. They are dead," Tabjonson says, his voice flat, emotionless. "No," Alexander says. "Hakon, maybe. We left him alive in Cadian custody, but he had many crimes to answer for. Olaf lives, recovering from his wounds inside those walls behind me." Tabjonson growls. "You should have killed them when you had the chance. When I have killed you, they will help me tear down this place, brick by brick." "Olaf does not agree with your cause, Ragnar," Alexander says. Tabjonson rolls his head along his thick neck with a series of audible cracks. "I don't care," he says. Alexander opens his mouth to reply, but the Jarl of Jarls lashes out with a sudden flurry of attacks. Alexander faced Tabjonson at Kilchester, but he kept his sword and axe on his belt. He wielded a long, crude cudgel then, a slow weapon but brutally painful. His paired steel weapons are in a whole different world than the cudgel was. The attacks come fast and furious, and Alexander can barely keep his sword up to parry. At least one blow connects with his armor. It catches the plate at a good angle for Alexander, and still he feels the shock of the impact. He clutches Dasha tight with his thighs, and just barely holds himself in the saddle. Alexander counters with a furious attack of his own. It rakes past Tabjonson's plate, but he doesn't stagger or flinch. Tabjonson may want to fight Alexander on his own, but Steelshod has no such qualms. Leon, Gerald, Luke, and Levin surge in, crowding the Jarl, slashing, smashing, and stabbing at him. He snarls, kicks out at Luke's horse. The horse screams as its foreleg is shattered, and it topples over. Luke tumbles to the ground, recovering quickly. Elsewhere, the battle rages. Duke Rodrigo's Septimanians begin pushing through the Svardic lines, fighting their way to the heathen priests that keep chanting. The Vlari priests try to maintain their assault of fear magic, directing the brunt of it at Rodrigo's men. Duke Diaz calls out a command, the God's Eye formation. The men do as he says, their lines reshaping to take the form of a Simaruta. The fear dissipates, and they cleave through the priests. Unferth stands his ground, his axe and shield a flurry of movement, slashing and smashing Olivenko, Leona, Zelda, and now Miles. He speaks the word fell again. Leona's Simruta burns her flesh, and she is forced to her knees, using all her willpower to withstand the urge to turn on her allies. Perrin has withdrawn to try to keep his battle lines intact. Hubert arrives, buying him some time by blanketing this side of the battlefield in a fog of black smoke, driving Tarathian and Svard alike back. Then he turns his attention to Leona and Unferth. At the center of it all, the commanders fight. Tebjonsson drives his sword at Alexander, but Alexander ducks to the side. With his other hand, the Jarl of Jarls smashes his axe into Gerald's horse. The axe cleaves through the stallion's neck and shoulder, killing it, and continues into the knight's leg. Gerald's plate crumbles. His knee explodes in a burst of blood and bone. When his horse goes down, he goes with it, screaming in pain. "Oliver, get Gerald out of here!" Alexander cries, striking at Tebjonsson again. The lad rides up, Michel joining him. On foot, Luke moves to stand over Gerald as one of Tebjonsson's men surges forward to finish the job. Luke fights the Svardic warrior while Michel and Oliver struggle to extract Gerald, who is rapidly losing consciousness. Hrafn steps up to deal with him, and suddenly Luke has a second figure at his side. The Black Wizard, one-eyed, wounded, stands beside him. They both fight defensively as Hrafn sweeps at them with broad, reckless swings of his huge stone maul. Behind them, Evan and Anatoly have rejoined the fight, rearmed, and the worst of their wounds hastily seen to by Agrippa and Orson just behind the battle lines. They surge in as well, though two of Hrafn's Bearsarks join him. "Your men can't save you, Ruskin," Tebjonsson tells Alexander calmly. Alexander and Tebjonsson exchange a few more blows. Leon and Levin still try to assist. Tebjonsson catches Leon with his axe on a backswing, using the long steel point opposite the axe head. It punches through Leon's plate like paper, leaving a bleeding puncture in the Lorinet knight's leg. Leon is made of sturdy stuff, and though the blow injures his leg, it does not drop him out of the fight. "You'll just get them killed along with you." "Ragnar, it does not have to happen this way," Alexander says. At a curt gesture from their commander, Leon and Levin twist away, lending their aid to Yorin and Luke, leaving the commander of Steelshod and the commander of the Svards facing each other alone. "Of course it does," Tebjonsson says. He staggers Alexander again with a blow. "It was always going to." Alexander drives Tebjonsson back a step with a vicious thrust, leaving a visible gouge in his plate. "Why?" Alexander says. "For vengeance? What happened to you? What happened to Sigrun? It was terrible." "Do not speak her name." Tebjonsson snarls, showing uncharacteristic emotion. He unleashes another flurry of blows at Alexander, but Alexander skirts out of reach entirely. "So you can feel something still," Alexander says. "I feel," Tebjonsson says, regaining his composure. "I feel every day, Ruskin. I failed. She is dead because of me. I am no champion. I am no hero. I am no Jarl. I am a dead man, but I will see everything you care for, everything that church represents. Die with me." "For Sigrun," Alexander says. He lowers his sword slightly. "For Sigrun!" Tebjonsson snarls, lunging. Alexander expected this, and he stays on the defensive, barely fending off the attack. "She is dead, Ragnar," Alexander says, wincing as one of Tebjonsson's blows rattles his armor. "You think yourself responsible, and yet you have killed her 1,000 more times since then." Tebjonsson glares, pressing the attack. "You have killed 1,000 Sigruns, 1,000 mothers and fathers and children with these wars. For what? Vengeance will not bring her back." Alexander counterattacks, driving Bjornsson back a step. I don't want her back. I don't deserve it. Bjornsson growls. I just want you to hurt. You have lost, Ragnar, Alexander says. Look around you. Once you were a jarl, a king that could have united the world. But you spat on your own self. You killed Ragnar Variksson. This union you formed from hate and fear did not last. It never could have. Some distance between them now, they probe one another. Both Alexander and Bjornsson are bleeding in half a dozen places, their armor dented and gouged. The Ruskins have betrayed you. The Casselines have betrayed you. Not even your own Svards want this war. Olaf himself told me it was a folly. A lie, Bjornsson says quietly. You know that it is not. You know Olaf better than I. He wanted this. Bjornsson glares at Alexander, mouth drawn to a thin line. It's over. Your army is surrounded. You never could have survived when Kashar's army returned, but I don't think you ever wanted to. You will not even live that long. You're losing this fight, Ruskin, Bjornsson spits. Alexander nods, his face pale. I am. Perhaps I will die, but I fight for something I believe in. I fight to oppose a great evil and to defend innocence. Innocence, Bjornsson says. No one that follows that lying, murdering snake of a god is innocent. They are, and you know they are. You simply choose not to care, Alexander says. But you will lose. You will never breach the walls of Nahash. Your men will never set foot in the Amud Kahal. Bjornsson chuckles at this. Behind him, Sakapis joins in, a rasping little laugh. They already have, Bjornsson says. Alexander cocks his head at this. I anticipated the possibility of a full assault. Sakapis rasps from behind the Jarl of Jarls. Desperate, foolish, but... Sakapis nods at where Varley sits mounted, some 10 feet behind Alexander. Brutus always was fond of such foolhardy tactics. You're too aggressive, Brutus. You overplayed your hand. Did I? Varley asks, urging his horse a few feet closer. He is just as old as Sakapis, but after nearly a year of Agrippa's ministrations, he looks far healthier and sturdier than the Casseline, and he is smiling. I set aside a few hundred men, Sakapis says, hidden in the northern outer city. When they saw you file out of the keep, that was their cue to strike. You can't have left more than a few dozen peasants watching the walls. Varley nods. Less than that, even, he agrees. He is still smiling. Bjornsson looks back to Alexander. You see, you've lost. By now your council is dead. The Tarathi Cathedral desecrated. I do not think so, Alexander says. Varley? Aye, they'd be speaking of the men Khalid and Olaf took care of this morning, Varley says, nodding. Explained to 'em that we had the buildings surrounded, but if they came out quietly, Olaf would see that they lived, and were treated fairly. Sakapis blinks, unable to hide his shock at the words. Varley shoots him a wink. You always did put too much faith in the cleverness of your schemes, Abello. You may have written the book on strategy, but you're not that original. Sorry to break the scheme, but in reality, Sakapis just used surprise, retroactively declaring a reserve force in an advantageous position, and Varley just used foresight, which lets him negate an enemy surprise or maneuver. I planned both events in advance with logical explanations for them as a good illustration of the role Sakapis and Varley have inevitably been filling. The classic wizard role of constantly counterspelling each other so that their presence is functionally negated in most cases, letting the warriors and secondary strategists like Cyril and Alexander use their abilities unimpeded. Tabjonsen visibly shakes with frustration. He turns to Alexander, pressing the attack again. "Ragnar," Alexander says, struggling to maintain a defense, "listen to me." Tabjonsen says nothing, fighting furiously. Anatoly diverts from the other battle to try to lend Alexander a hand. Tabjonsen spares a single swing from his axe for the Ruskin, killing his horse and sending him tumbling to the ground, cradling a wounded arm. Varley and Sakapus stare at each other, momentarily ignoring the fight between Alexander and Tabjonsen. "Well played, Brutus," Sakapus says, "but you overlooked something." "Did I?" Varley says. "You're too close to the battlefront," Sakapus says simply. He speaks a command in Svardic. A Svardic warrior emerges from the ranks behind him, darting past the crippled Anatolian between the two fights, rushing straight for Varley. The old man's eyes widen as he realizes his allies are all indisposed. The Svard is a simple reaver, bearing a sword and shield, a cut above the common riffraff, but he is no renowned champion. Still, more than enough to kill a feeble old man. A Tarathian conscript steps up to defend Varley, and the Svard cuts him down with a single blow. He reaches Varley, tosses his shield aside, yanks the horse's bridle from Varley's grasp. He raises his sword, and from the chaotic throng of terrified peasants, a single, unassuming peasant jumps forth, nothing more than a dagger in his hand. Chauncey throws himself on the Svard's back, his dagger rising and falling in a rapid series of thrusts to the face, neck, and chest. Chauncey and the Svard fall to the ground, but only Chauncey stands. You all right, Mr. Varley?" Chauncey says. Sakapus glares at Varley. Varley smiles, touches his forehead in a faint salute. "Sorry, old friend," he says, "but you know, you're as close to the battlefront as I." From the midst of the throng, a small figure steps forward, crossbow raised. Prudence looses a bolt. Sakapus holds his hand up, covering his face, and the small bolt pierces his arm. He winces, immediately wheels his horse, fleeing further behind the lines. Varley smiles at Chauncey and Prudence. He had his own surprise, setting aside troops from the battlefield to bring them in when and where he chooses, so long as it's not physically implausible, and Sakapus had burned through his own countermeasures already. He wonders aloud if Sakapus will escape, or if this is the last time they will face one another on the battlefield. Prudence says she doubts that he will see Sakapus again. She doesn't mention that Cyril gave her a vial of venom, told her he would consider it a personal favor if she could use it on either Sakapus or Unferth. Tabjonsen fights like a demon, and Alexander realizes, not for the first time, that he truly is outclassed. "Ragnar, it's over," Alexander says. "You cannot take Nahash. You cannot take the Serpentes. You cannot win." "I can kill you," he says coldly. "This I can win." "You can," Alexander agrees, striking back as hard as he can. "Why?" "It's all I have left," Tabjonsen says. "I have tried to die on my own terms. It was denied me. So I will spit on Torath and his champions until they killed me like they killed Sigrun. I have no other choice." "You can always choose, Ragnar. You are choosing this, here, now, this death. You could choose differently." "I am done with choosing, Ruskin. Kill me or die. Those are your choices." Alexander slams Tabjonsen back with a mighty blow, a swift and terrible strike. The Jarl of Jarls staggers, and when he catches himself, he sees Alexander lower his sword. Terbjornsson pauses in his onslaught. "Why?" he says. "Once you sought to unite the world. You fought hard for a future that those around you could not see. That future is gone," Terbjornsson says hollowly. "I see it, Ragnar," Alexander says. His voice is calm. "Others see it too. We see a future of peace and unity." "You are fools." Alexander nods. "We may be, but we see it, Ragnar, as you did, and I think we know how to achieve it." Terbjornsson raises his sword and axe. "You will see nothing when I kill you, Ruskin. Your dream, this thing you see, it dies with you." No, it doesn't. Joran has extracted himself from the melee with Hrafn. He stands to Alexander's right, Terbjornsson's left. "Alexander forged us from steel, and he will always live on in us." Terbjornsson hesitates, staring at the two of them. His eyes are far from dead. His face, far from emotionless. "You will never succeed," he says. "Maybe not, Ragnar, but we will try," Alexander says. "And that is why we had to stop you." Ragnar looks around the battlefield, sees the dead and dying men fighting all around him. "I can't stop now," he whispers. "Yes, you can," Alexander says. "I must have vengeance," Ragnar says. His voice is ragged. "For Sigrun. There is no other way." "There is always another way, Ragnar," Alexander says. "Look at what we have wrought. Here. This is what you want? What Sigrun wanted?" Ragnar lowers his sword and axe. "I don't know," he whispers. I can't even remember." "End this, Ragnar," Alexander says softly. "No one else has to die." Ragnar looks around, wondering how he could fill Alexander's request. Even if he wanted to. Does he want to? Something inside him has broken, and here, he thought he was already as broken as it was possible to be. Ragnar feels a rage boiling beneath the surface of his skin, always there, fueling his battle fury, giving him strength. He lets his axe and sword fall to the bloody, frozen ground, reaches up, and tears away the clasp of his bearskin. Hrafn roars in surprise, smashes Steelshod's warriors back. Easily done, as they've been engaging him with a lot of caution. He strides over to Ragnar, shouting in Svardic. Ragnar looks up at him, anguish etched across his broad, hard features. "I can't keep going," he tells Hrafn in Middish. "You must!" Hrafn growls. "You are the Terbjornsson." Ragnar shakes his head. "I'm done," he says. "It's over." Hrafn grabs Ragnar, shakes him. "You must! The Terbjornsson does not choose, he is chosen." Alexander and Joran both shift into fighting stances, ready to intervene, then pause. Behind Ragnar, the white bearskin he has discarded shudders on the ground. Ragnar can't see what happens behind him, but his men do. They back away, murmuring to themselves. He just shrugs out of Hrafn's grip. "I'm done, old man," he says. "Done with all of it. If that doesn't satisfy you, then kill me." The bearskin suddenly lurches up, standing of its own accord. Alexander and Joran can see that, rather than an etched leather pelt, beneath the fur the bearskin has filled out. Raw, bloody muscle and sinew has begun to form. Hrafn shakes his head. "You cannot be done," he says. "Ter has not released you yet." "Ragnar," Alexander says. Ragnar looks to Alexander, confused, and the bearskin slams back upon him. He screams, doubles over, convulses, and grows. Before their eyes, muscle and raw flesh rapidly piles on top of him, the bearskin swelling and stretching as it uses Ragnar's body as a scaffolding upon which it creates something else. His plate armor and weapons are pulled into the twisting mass of muscle and meat. Pieces of steel plate push through in a haphazard fashion. In seconds, where Ragnar once stood, something else rises. A hush falls across the battlefield as this thing rises, high enough to be seen in all corners of the fighting. A white bear, its flesh a mix of white fur, steel plate, and raw, bloody muscle. It towers twice as tall as Ragnar stood, or more. At least 20 feet. Steel blades jut out of its huge claws. All across the battlefield, every bearsark on the field screams as one, their minds clouded with pain and rage and bloodlust. Taken by a frenzy, they all fall upon the nearest living creature, trying to rip them apart. The creature roars, a sound so loud and deafening that it shakes Jaspar's chest where he stands, on the tower above the inner circle. Of all the bearsarks around Alexander and Yoren, Hrafn alone seems to retain control of his faculties. He turns to face them, his broad face a strange mix of elation and regret. "The Terbjornsson does not choose," he says. "He is chosen." Thank you for tuning in to Steelshod, a series by Mostly Rights, narrated by Tailforge. You can find every chapter in text format, as well as character sheets, setting information, maps, and rule documents on the Steelshod tabletop system in the link below. If you'd like to support the channel, you can pop down to the description and use the Patreon link for recurring donations, the paypal.me link for one-time donations, the Teespring link for shirts with the incredibly cool background art by Nobody, or use the DriveThruRPG affiliate link the next time you're looking to try a new system. If you'd like to support the author, you can find Steelshod merch on the MostlyRights.com store, or donate to the Mostly Rights Patreon, which are both linked on reddit.com/r/mostlyrights down below.